Now, if the Phillips curve is empirically problematic and has been debunked in its original formulation, why are we still talking about this? And this brings us back to the question what the long-term unemployment rate in an aggregate economy is going to return to. Now, keep in mind that the Phillips curve at face value was policy advice. If Phillips had been correct, then governments could effectively control the unemployment rate. We know that we can control inflation by moving around the money supply. If we increase money growth, the inflation rate is going to increase. If we decrease money growth, the inflation rate is going to decrease. That follows straightforward from ASAD. Now, if the relationship between inflation and unemployment were stable, higher inflation could be accepted for lower unemployment or vice versa. Now, while it's great on paper, some economists very early on, and specifically Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps, pointed out as early in the 1960s that this trade-off was unlikely to be stable, and that money over time should be neutral or super-neutral. We already know what neutral means. It means that changes in the money supply do not affect the level of any real variables like GDP. Super-neutral simply is an extension of that. It means that changes in the inflation rate should not affect anything in the real economy consistently. It might do so in the short run, for sure, but over longer periods of time, all prices should adjust to inflation. Now, what's the historical benchmark in this? One of the things that we've seen, and especially in the 1970s and other periods, is that if the unemployment rate becomes very low given the overall equilibrium level of output, inflation tends to accelerate a lot. So very tight labor markets are associated with growing wages, very quickly growing wages, and potentially very high inflation. Now, the 1970s first saw the oil price crisis, and then policymakers responded by the standards of the time, which meant increasing the money supply. The consequence of that was a lot of money growth in the decade, which caused very high inflation by the end of the decade, at least by US standards. So the inflation rate approached about two-digit percentages, 10% around that much. At the same time, there was less and less evidence that the monetary stimulus would actually suppress unemployment. This is, as you know, a period known as stagflation. Now, in general, the way that economists today look at this is by assuming that some short-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation is possible. Every time the Federal Reserve, at least up until this quantitative easing period, increased the money supply, every time it cut interest rates, unemployment tends to fall for some period of time compared to the Federal Reserve not doing that. But the general idea is this cannot happen consistently because money growth causes inflation. It only works if expectations are adaptive. If I always think that the inflation rate today is equal to the inflation rate yesterday, then a central bank could, by increasing inflation, just inflating a little bit more, trick me. The problem with that in reality is that if I consistently underestimate inflation, I will always ask for ex-ante real wages that are lower than my ex-post real wage. Basically, I'm always making myself off worse than what I had bargained for. And as Friedman and others pointed out, that can't be right? If you increase the inflation rate from year to year, eventually workers will pick up on that. And once they pick up on it, they will, forward-looking, ask for higher and higher nominal wages. Eventually, in terms of economic history, this led to a discussion of rational expectations, which is associated with the names of Robert Lucas and Thomas Sargent, who in essence stated that, well, workers are not going to ignore information that is important for their standard of living. So if they know that inflation rates are going to accelerate, they're not going to form expectations adaptively. Rational expectations is a longer discussion. We will not have it at this point. We will come back to it at the end of the semester. It is something that is much more controversial than some other points in economics, but the general rationale, at least in this context, is sound. Namely, that if you consistently underestimate inflation, you make yourself worse off, so it's not feasible for a central bank to keep increasing inflation and workers never responding to that. Friedman and Phelps phrased the argument a little bit more simply. In essence, what they said is there's got to be a lower level for the unemployment rate, below which rates cannot be sustained without increasing the rate of inflation. So if unemployment becomes tight enough, eventually inflation has to accelerate, and that over longer periods of time has to push aggregate supply back. This natural rate of unemployment that is associated with this lower bound is the unemployment rate for which the actual inflation rate equals expected inflation. This is equation 9 here, and this is sometimes known as NAIRU. NAIRU stands for non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. I know it's a handful. What this is basically saying is there's got to be some level of unemployment for which actual inflation equals expected inflation. What this implies is that the ex-ante wages that workers bargain for are equal to their ex-post wages. And at this point, they have no more incentive to bargain for higher or potentially for lower wages if their employers try to push them down, because there's some sort of mis-expectation. Now, using this expression and substituting it back into aggregate supply yields what is known as NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And NAIRU is perhaps the most significant way that economists up to this day still think about the labor market equilibrium. What this implies is that the change in unemployment in inflation is equal to 0. Right? Inflation is whatever it is. We think it's 2%, it's going to be 2%. And on the right-hand side, you still have the rest of the aggregate supply expression. If we solve this for UN, we get an expression for equilibrium unemployment. The unemployment rate for which actual inflation equals expected inflation. Solving this expression is a relatively straightforward exercise. You bring alpha times u to the other side, divide by alpha, and this gives you an expression for equilibrium unemployment. Equilibrium unemployment will be higher if industries are less competitive and if there are more frictions in the labor market. On top of that, equilibrium unemployment will be lower if nominal wages respond more strongly to firm bargaining power. The latter point is not as important for our discussion. Now, with NAIRU on hand, we can reformulate aggregate supply. This once more is aggregate supply. Inflation is equal to expected inflation plus mu plus c minus alpha times ut. We've seen it a couple of times. This implies also that the difference between inflation and expected inflation, this is what we call the forecast error, is equal to mu plus c minus alpha times ut. Factoring out negative alpha, just a little bit of algebra, we'll get that the forecast error, the difference between inflation and expected inflation, is equal to negative alpha times ut minus mu plus c times alpha, divided by alpha, and this of course is the natural rate of unemployment. This gives us an expression for how inflation varies from expected inflation, depending on where we are in the business cycle. If the unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate, that means there's excess unemployment, there's cyclical unemployment. If this expression is positive, inflation will be smaller than expected inflation. This is usually the case in a recession. So inflation tends to drop, it tends to decelerate if there is excess labor market slack. If the current unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate, if this expression here becomes negative, then expected inflation is lower than actual inflation, and inflation will accelerate. Now, this is akin to this relationship I showed you in the graph in the previous segment. If we are at a point in the business cycle where the unemployment gap is positive, if we are in a recession, inflation tends to decelerate. If we're in a point in the business cycle where the unemployment gap is negative, where unemployment becomes very low, as has been the case, for instance, in recent years, then inflation should accelerate. This summarizes what I just said. I will say it one more time because it's an important way in which economists think about inflation. If unemployment is below the natural rate, if it's below NAIRU, inflation will pick up, it will become faster. If the actual unemployment rate is above NAIRU, disinflation will occur. Notice that there's always some inflation because we expect it. Right? So as long as we think that inflation is 2%, there's got to be at least 2%. If we're in the upswing, if labor markets are tight, inflation is potentially higher than 2%. If you're on the downswing, if the unemployment rate is relatively high, then inflation will be lower than 2%. Only if the natural rate of unemployment exactly equals actual unemployment, inflation will no longer change, and this defines a long-run equilibrium. This is really why we think of the natural rate of unemployment as the rate for which inflation will not change, and it is also associated with the natural level of output. It's associated with potential growth. One more time, here you have it written out, this terrible acronym, NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Now, a few years I would have stopped here and would have maybe summarized this, but the current discussion over the last 10 years is if NAIRU is really still relevant. And the reason for this is that the last expansion was a little bit different. Post-2008, unemployment rates have been very, very low. You may be aware of that. It is something that the president likes to tout often, although obviously the current situation changes a little bit. But unemployment in the United States has been the lowest since it has been in the 60s. So for a very long time, labor markets were very, very tight with this very long expansion. However, as it turns out to be the case, inflation after 2008 was lower than it was before. So we saw a period of disinflation. It's not entirely clear where that's coming from. Certainly prior to 2008, no one would have expected that the national unemployment rate would hit about 3% without seeing much inflation. Currently, what we've seen is still a little bit below the target that the Federal Reserve is setting, which is 2%. Now, what are potential explanations for this? We don't quite know why this has happened, but there are several stories that contributed for sure. One thing that happened during the Great Recession, labor market participation dropped dramatically. For one, among boomers who retired, but then there were also younger millennials specifically that no longer participated in labor markets as much as they did before. The labor market participation rate, the labor force participation rate in 2018 and 2020 still was lower than it was in 2008 and was lower than it was in the 2000s. This causes some reason for concern. It likely has to do with demographics. It potentially has to do with education. But one of the consequences of this observation is that a low unemployment rate tends to understate how much labor market slack there really is. For a long time, the unemployment rate in the last few years was fairly low, but we could still add jobs at about 150,000 each month because people would just rejoin the labor force that were previously not counted as unemployed. And that means that the unemployment rate itself becomes an unreliable measure of how tight the labor market is, how much bargaining power workers really have, and by how much incomes should increase and how much prices should increase. A second component that comes into this is that inflation has fallen from about 3% per year in the 2000s closer to something like 2 to 1.5% after 2008. And after 10 years of low inflation, it stands to argue that expected inflation itself has been falling. This is what we refer to as disinflation. Now, if as a baseline we assume that inflation is going to be 1.5% or 3%, then actual inflation is also going to be lower. And there's not much a central bank can do about this if interest rates are as low as they are. This is something that has given the Federal Reserve concern for some reason, especially if expected inflation becomes very, very small. We are approaching an area that starts to look more like the original Phillips curve, where you get a negative relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation overall, but where the acceleration or deceleration of unemployment no longer behaves along the line of the modified Phillips curve. Finally, there are reasons to believe that the relationship between wages and prices is less stable than suggested by the Phillips curve. The general idea here is that when labor markets tightened around 2015, wages eventually started to increase, but prices did not. And there are reasons to believe that that could happen as well, because firms have a buffer. Corporate profits are in excess of what they pay their workers. So because wages were so suppressed for a long time after 2008, what we call the labor share of income, how much of overall income that is created that workers take home, has fallen because wages were suppressed. Now, as wages started growing, this allowed firms to pay higher wages without immediately increasing prices because they had built up this capital buffer. Basically, that means the labor share of income is only getting back a larger share of income. Richard Cleary, the current chairman of the Fed, wrote a commentary on that I will post on the website. It is something you should read. I will probably include that in the homework as well. Just as a final note, let me show you what this looks like in the graph. The blue line here is inflation year to year from 2008 to 2019 based on all consumer prices. And you notice that inflation, of course, during the recession itself was pretty low. But then in the years thereafter, it was lower too. We certainly never really reached the 3% we had in the 2000s. On average, we're coming out somewhere around 1.5%. But even in 2015, inflation was very low. And in 2019, oddly enough, despite very, very low unemployment rates, the inflation rate actually decelerated again. That's not really in line with what the augmented Phillips curve suggests, which has given